The boy doesn't speak for the first 3 weeks. He eats the meals Margaret prepares, sleeps in the small room she's cleared for him, and tends her garden with an instinct that seems impossible for a child who claims to remember nothing before the mountains. But Margaret notices things. The way plants grow faster where he walks, the way her arthritis pain lessens when he's near, the way wild animals come to the cottage windows at dusk, not threatening, but watching, protecting. When the village pastor organizes a group to force the boy out, claiming his presence brings evil, Margaret stands her ground. The only evil here, she tells them, is fear dressed up as righteousness. But that night, when men with torches approach her cottage, something awakens in the boy. His eyes flash with ancient light, the ground trembles, and Margaret realizes the village was right about one thing. This child does carry power. The question isn't whether he's dangerous. The question is whether he can learn to control what lives inside him before it consumes them all. The knock came at midnight. Soft but insistent, Margaret Hayes set down her knitting and moved toward the door with the careful steps of a 73-year-old woman whose joints protested every movement. Living alone in the cottage at the edge of Pinehaven meant few visitors, and none after dark. Through the frosted window, she could make out a small figure hunched against the November cold. A child. Margaret opened the door to find a boy, perhaps 10 years old, swaying on her doorstep. Blood seeped through his tattered shirt, and his bare feet left crimson prints on her porch. But it was his eyes that held her attention, pale gray, almost silver, with a quality that suggested he was looking through her rather than at her. "Please," he whispered, the word barely audible. "They said you were kind." Then he collapsed. Margaret caught him before he hit the ground, surprised by how light he was despite appearing well-fed. She dragged him inside with strength born of necessity, kicking the door closed against the winter wind. Under her lamp's harsh light, the boy's condition revealed itself in terrible detail. Wounds crisscrossed his back, not random but deliberate. Burns on his arms formed patterns that looked almost ritualistic, and across his chest a series of silver scars that couldn't be more than weeks old, already healed but raised and strange, as if the tissue beneath had transformed into something other than human flesh. "Lord above," Margaret breathed, reaching for her phone. But as her fingers touched it, the boy's hand shot out, gripping her wrist with surprising strength. "No authorities," he gasped, his eyes opening. "Please, they'll send me back. They'll finish what they started. Child, you need a hospital. These wounds will heal." His voice carried an odd certainty. "They always do. I just need rest, safety, for a little while." Margaret studied him, 40 years of teaching experience reading the truth beneath his words. This was a child who had learned to fear adults, to expect betrayal from those who should protect. Whatever had happened to him had taught him that survival meant trusting no one. "I'll make you a deal," she said finally. "Let me clean and dress these wounds. Let me feed you. You can sleep in my spare room tonight, and in the morning we'll talk about what happens next. Fair?" The boy's suspicious expression softened slightly. "You won't call anyone while I'm sleeping? I give you my word." Something in her tone must have convinced him. He nodded and allowed her to help him to the kitchen table. As Margaret cleaned his wounds with warm water and antiseptic, she noticed something peculiar. Where she expected him to wince or cry out, he remained perfectly still, as if his relationship with pain was different than most children's. And the wounds themselves, while horrific in appearance, seemed to be healing even as she watched them, edges knitting together, inflammation reducing before her eyes. "What's your name?" she asked, wrapping clean bandages around his torso. "I don't remember," he replied softly. "Everything before the mountains is fog." "How long were you in the mountains?" "I don't know. Time moved strangely there." Margaret finished bandaging him and prepared a simple meal, soup and bread, warm milk with honey. The boy ate with careful deliberation, as if food were a formal ritual rather than sustenance. "I'm Margaret," she offered, "Margaret Hayes. I taught school here in Pinehaven for 40 years before I retired." "Teacher," the boy repeated, testing the word. "That's someone who helps others understand things they don't know yet." "That's right. Then maybe you can help me understand what I am." The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implications Margaret wasn't sure she was ready to explore, but she'd opened her door to this strange, wounded child, and that meant accepting responsibility for whatever came next. She showed him to the spare room, small but clean, with a window overlooking her neglected garden. "Bathroom is across the hall. There are extra blankets in the closet if you get cold. Try to rest." The boy nodded and moved to the window, staring out at the moonlit garden with an expression of longing. "Your plants are dying." "I know," Margaret admitted. "My hands don't work like they used to. Arthritis makes gardening difficult." "That's sad," the boy said softly. "They want to grow. I can feel them wanting." Before Margaret could respond, he'd turned from the window and climbed into bed, pulling the blankets around himself, with the exhausted movements of someone who'd been running for far too long. She left him there and returned to the kitchen, her mind spinning. She should call the sheriff. She should call social services. A wounded child appearing at midnight with stories of abuse and mountains and memory loss. This was beyond her capability to handle alone, yet something stayed her hand. Some instinct honed over decades of working with damaged children told her that involving authorities now would drive this boy away, and he'd disappear back into whatever hell he'd escaped from. Margaret made herself a cup of chamomile tea and sat at her kitchen table, listening to the old house settle around her. In the spare room, she could hear the boy's breathing slow and deepen as sleep finally claimed him. Tomorrow, she told herself, tomorrow she'd figure out what to do. But when morning came, everything had changed. Margaret woke to sunlight streaming through her bedroom window at an angle that suggested late morning rather than her usual early rising. She dressed quickly, alarmed by oversleeping, and hurried to check on her unexpected guest. The spare room was empty, the bed neatly made. Panic flared. He'd run during the night, and she'd slept through his departure. Then she heard humming from outside. Through her kitchen window, Margaret saw the boy in her garden, working with focused intensity. He moved between the neglected beds, touching plants with gentle fingers, whispering words she couldn't hear. And everywhere he touched, life responded. Margaret stepped outside into morning air that should have been November cold but felt like spring. The boy knelt beside her rosebush, which had been nothing but thorns and dead wood yesterday, now sporting tiny green shoots of new growth. "Good morning," she said carefully, not wanting to startle him. He looked up and Margaret gasped. In daylight, the silver quality of his eyes was even more pronounced, and there was something else, a faint luminescence beneath his skin, as if he were lit from within by some gentle inner fire. "Your garden was calling for help," he explained. "I couldn't sleep with all the voices, so I came out to quiet them." Voices? Margaret moved closer, examining the impossible transformation of her garden. Every plant showed signs of revival, brown leaves greening, drooping stalks straightening, flowers blooming out of season. "Everything living has a voice," the boy said simply. "You just have to know how to listen. Plants are easier than animals. Animals think too much. Plants just are." Margaret sank onto her garden bench, her knees suddenly weak. "Child, what are you? I told you, I don't know." He stood, brushing dirt from his borrowed pants. "I woke up in the mountains 3 months ago with these scars and no memories. At first I thought I was normal, but then the animals started following me, and plants would grow where I walked. And when I focused on something injured," he held out his hands, "I could make it better." "You're a healer," Margaret breathed. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm something that should have stayed in the mountains where no one could be afraid of me." "Why would anyone be afraid of you?" The boy's expression darkened. "Because before I found you, I tried to get help in Pinehaven. I went to the church first because I remembered churches were supposed to be sanctuaries. But when Pastor Wells saw me, he called me an abomination. He said I carried the devil's mark." He touched his chest where the silver scars lay hidden beneath his shirt. "He tried to cast me out. When that didn't work, he and some other men tried to purify me." Understanding crashed over Margaret. The burns, the wounds, they hadn't been random abuse. They'd been systematic torture, masquerading as exorcism. "Those men hurt you," she said, fury and horror mixing in her voice. "They were afraid," the boy replied with unsettling understanding. "Fear makes people cruel. I learned that quickly." "How did you escape?" "The earth helped me. When they had me tied in the church basement, praying over me with hot irons, the ground opened up. Just a little crack, but enough. I slipped through and ran. Hid in the forest until my wounds healed enough to travel. Then I remembered someone mentioning you, the old teacher who lived alone and was kind to everyone, even the difficult children. I thought maybe you'd be kind to me too." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. This child had been tortured by men who claimed to serve God, had crawled through the earth to escape, and had survived alone in the wilderness for who knew how long, all to find someone who might show him basic human decency. "You were right to come here," she said firmly, "and you're safe now. Do you understand? You're safe." The boy studied her with those ancient, knowing eyes. "For how long? They're still in the village. They'll hear I'm here eventually. Let them hear. This is my property, and you're under my protection. You don't know what you're promising, what they'll do." "I know exactly what I'm promising," Margaret interrupted. "I'm 73 years old. I've watched this village slide from decent community into small-minded fear-mongering, led by men like Pastor Wells, who use religion to justify cruelty. If taking you in means standing against them, then so be it." The boy looked like he might cry, but instead he simply nodded and returned to tending the garden. Margaret watched him work, noticing how the morning sun caught the silver traces in his scars, how birds gathered in the trees around him, how even the frost seemed to retreat from where he knelt. Whatever he was, whatever had happened to him in those mountains, she was going to help him figure it out. and she was going to keep him safe from those who would hurt him out of fear and ignorance. The morning passed peacefully. Margaret prepared a proper breakfast while the boy continued his work outside. By noon, her garden looked better than it had in 5 years. When she called him in to eat, she found her hands moving more easily, the constant ache of arthritis significantly reduced. "You're doing that," she said, holding up her fingers and flexing them without pain. "Healing me." "I don't mean to," the boy replied, looking worried. "It just happens when I'm near people who are hurt. I can't control it. Don't apologize for making me feel better than I have in years." Margaret smiled. "Though we should probably talk about control. If you're going to stay here, and I hope you will, we need to figure out the extent of your abilities." The boy took a bite of eggs, considering. "In the mountains, when I was alone, I felt bigger, like I was part of everything around me. But when I got close to the village, to people, I felt smaller, compressed, like I had to pull everything in tight to avoid being noticed." "Show me," Margaret encouraged, "what you can do. I promise I won't be afraid." The boy set down his fork and closed his eyes. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Margaret felt it, a subtle shift in the air, a humming vibration just below hearing. The houseplants in her kitchen began to grow, their leaves unfurling, stems reaching toward the boy as if drawn by invisible threads. "That's remarkable," Margaret breathed. The boy opened his eyes, and they glowed with that inner silver light. "There's more. Watch." He held his hand palm up over the table. Above his skin, tiny points of light began to gather, swirling into a miniature galaxy of luminescence. The lights coalesced into shapes, first abstract, then forming into a perfect replica of a bird in flight, wings spread, every feather distinct. "It's beautiful," Margaret whispered. The light bird dissolved, and the boy slumped slightly. "It takes energy. If I do too much, I get tired. Then rest. We have time." Margaret reached across the table and took his hand. "What should I call you? You need a name." The boy thought for a long moment. "The earth called me something when I was sleeping in the mountains. It wasn't a word exactly, but it felt like Rowan, like the tree. Rowan." Margaret tested it. "It suits you. Strong and enduring, connected to the old ways." "Then that's who I'll be," the boy Rowan said with a small smile. "At least until I remember who I was before." The peaceful afternoon shattered at 3 o'clock when heavy boots stomped onto Margaret's porch. She opened the door to find Pastor Wells flanked by 2 large men she recognized as church deacons, Thomas Miller and James Hartwick. "Margaret," Pastor Wells said, his voice carrying false warmth, "we need to speak with you about a dangerous individual who may have approached your property." "I'm not aware of any dangerous individuals," Margaret replied coolly, not opening the door wider. "The demon child," Wells pressed. "The one I've been warning the congregation about, silver-scarred and devil-marked. He escaped our custody several weeks ago. We have reason to believe he's been seen in this area." "Custody?" Margaret's voice hardened. "Is that what you call torturing a child?" Wells's expression flickered. "We were performing an exorcism. The boy carries evil within him. The only evil I'm aware of is standing on my porch." Margaret moved to close the door, but Miller wedged his boot in the gap. "We know he's here," Miller growled. "Your garden is blooming in November, Margaret. That ain't natural. That's his doing." "My garden is my business. Harboring a demon is everyone's business," Wells insisted. "Margaret, please. We're trying to save that boy's soul and protect the village from what he might do if left unchecked." "What he might do?" Margaret laughed bitterly. "You mean heal people? Make plants grow? Bring beauty into a world full of ugly, small-minded men like you? Blasphemy," Wells hissed. "That boy is an affront to God's natural order. God's natural order includes children being born with gifts you're too limited to understand. Now get off my property before I call the sheriff." "The sheriff answers to the church council," Hartwick said coldly, "and the council has declared that boy a threat to Pinehaven's spiritual welfare. Hand him over, Margaret. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Margaret felt Rowan's presence behind her before she saw him. The boy stood in the hallway, his expression calm but his eyes glowing with that silver light. "I'll go with them," he said quietly. "I don't want you hurt because of me." "Absolutely not," Margaret replied firmly. Then she turned back to the men on her porch. "Listen carefully. This boy is under my protection. He's done nothing wrong, committed no crime, and I won't let you drag him back to your torture chamber disguised as a church basement." "You're making a grave mistake," Wells warned. "That thing is not a child. It's something else, something that crawled out of the mountains carrying dark power." "The only darkness I see is in your hearts," Margaret interrupted. "Now leave, immediately." The 3 men exchanged glances, and Margaret saw the violence in their eyes. They weren't used to being defied, especially not by an elderly woman, but they also weren't quite willing to force their way into her home. "Not yet. This isn't over," Wells said finally. "The council will meet tonight. There will be consequences for harboring evil." They left, and Margaret locked the door with trembling hands. She turned to find Rowan watching her with those two old eyes. "They'll come back," he said, "with more men. They won't stop until they have me. Then we'll face them together," Margaret replied, "because I'm not letting them hurt you again. Not while I have breath in my body." That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She sat in her living room, watching through the window as lights moved through Pinehaven's streets. The village was restless, and she knew why. Wells would be rallying his supporters, telling tales of demonic possession and righteous duty. Around midnight, she heard soft footsteps and turned to find Rowan standing in the hallway. "You should be sleeping," she said gently. "So should you." He moved to sit beside her. "I'm sorry I brought trouble to your door. You brought nothing but yourself, and yourself is welcome here. The trouble belongs to those who can't accept that different doesn't mean dangerous." "But I am dangerous," Rowan said softly. "I can feel it, Mrs. Hayes. Whatever lives inside me, it's powerful. When Pastor Wells hurt me, when he pressed hot iron to my skin, I wanted to hurt him back. I wanted to make the earth swallow him whole. And I could have. I felt the mountain's anger rising in me, felt the ground ready to obey. I only barely stopped it." Margaret absorbed this, understanding the weight of what he was confessing. "Power isn't the same as evil, Rowan. What matters is what you choose to do with it. What if I choose wrong? Then you learn and choose better next time. That's what it means to grow up, making mistakes and learning from them. Your power doesn't change that." Rowan leaned against her shoulder, the gesture so achingly childlike it made Margaret's heart clench. "I wish I knew where I came from, who made me this way, whether there are others like me. Maybe we'll find those answers together," Margaret suggested. "But right now, what matters is keeping you safe." As if summoned by her words, orange light flickered in the village below. Torches, at least 20 of them, moving together through the streets toward the edge of town, toward her cottage. "They're coming," Rowan whispered, his voice carrying no surprise. "I knew they would." Margaret stood, her jaw set with determination. "Go to your room. Lock the door. Whatever happens, don't come out until I tell you it's safe." "Mrs. Hayes, do as I say, Rowan, please." The boy hesitated, then nodded and disappeared down the hallway. Margaret heard the click of his door lock, then moved to her own room to retrieve something she hadn't touched in years, her late husband's hunting rifle. She'd never fired it at a living person, and prayed she wouldn't have to start now, but she'd be damned if she let a mob drag a child from her home without a fight. The torches reached her property line and stopped. Margaret counted at least 30 people, many carrying farming tools repurposed as weapons. Pastor Wells stood at their head, his face grim in the flickering light. Margaret stepped onto her porch, rifle held across her chest. "That's far enough." "Margaret, be reasonable," Wells called. "We don't want to hurt you. Just give us the boy." "That won't happen." "The church council has voted," Wells continued. "The demon child must be removed from Pinehaven for the safety of all. If you continue to harbor him, you'll be considered complicit in his evil." "Then I'm complicit," Margaret replied calmly. "Now get off my property before I start shooting." Several men in the crowd laughed, not taking the threat seriously. Margaret raised the rifle and fired a shot into the air. The laughter died. "The next one won't be a warning," she said coldly. Wells's expression hardened. "So be it, Thomas. James, retrieve the boy. If Margaret resists, restrain her." Gently, he added, as if that made forced entry acceptable. The two deacons started forward, and Margaret leveled the rifle at them. "One more step and I'll—" The ground trembled. At first it was subtle, just a vibration that might have been mistaken for a passing truck. Then it grew stronger, violent enough to make people stumble. The torches wavered, several falling to the ground. "What's happening?" someone in the crowd shouted. The trembling intensified, and cracks appeared in the earth. Not random, but deliberate, spreading outward from Margaret's cottage in perfect geometric patterns. The cracks glowed with silver light. "Rowan," Margaret breathed. "No, please." But it was too late. The boy had awakened to his power. The cottage door flew open, and Rowan emerged. His eyes blazed with inner fire, his skin traced with those silver scars that now pulsed with luminescence. He looked simultaneously like a 10-year-old child and something impossibly ancient. "Leave her alone." His voice came out layered, as if multiple voices spoke through him at once. "Leave us alone." "See," Wells shouted, backing away but pointing an accusing finger. "This is the evil I warned you about. The demon shows its true face." "I'm not a demon," Rowan said, and with each word the ground pulsed. "I'm what the mountain made, to heal what's broken, to grow what's dying, to protect what's vulnerable. But you," he focused on Wells, "you hurt and torture and call it holy." "Rowan, stop," Margaret called, but the boy didn't seem to hear her. His attention was fixed on the pastor, and the silver light in his eyes had taken on a dangerous edge. "You burned me," Rowan continued, his voice resonating with power. "You said I was evil because I could do things you couldn't, because I was different, so you tried to destroy me." The earth beneath Pastor Wells's feet began to sink, the soil turning liquid and drawing him down. he screamed, clawing at solid ground, but the earth had other intentions. Rowan. Margaret dropped her rifle and ran to the boy, grabbing his shoulders. This isn't the answer. You're better than this. They hurt me, Rowan said, and for the first time he sounded like the child he appeared to be. Tears streamed down his face, glowing silver as they fell. They hurt me so much, Mrs. Hayes, and I was alone and scared, and no one helped me. I know, sweetheart, I know. Margaret turned him away from the crowd, forcing him to look at her instead. What they did was evil, but becoming what they fear won't change that. It'll just give them justification for their hate. I don't want to hurt anyone, Rowan sobbed. I just want to be left alone. Why won't they leave me alone? Because people fear what they don't understand. But you're stronger than their fear, Rowan. You're better than their violence. Show them that. The boy's glowing eyes met hers, and Margaret saw the internal struggle playing out. The power wanted release, wanted vengeance. But the child, the frightened, hurt child, at the core of all that power, wanted peace. I don't know how to stop it, Rowan whispered. It's too big. It wants out. Then let it out, Margaret said. But show them healing, not harm. Show them what you really are. Rowan closed his eyes, and the trembling earth stilled. The silver light that had been destructive transformed into something gentler. It spread across the ground like water, and where it touched, flowers bloomed. Not just any flowers, every variety that had ever grown in these mountains, erupting from the soil in a carpet of impossible color. The glowing cracks sealed themselves, but the flowers remained, spreading outward from the cottage in waves of beauty. They climbed the trees, adorned the houses, filled the air with fragrance that spoke of spring and growth and life. The mob stood frozen, weapons lowered, staring at the transformed landscape. Even Pastor Wells, pulled from the now solid ground by his companions, stood speechless. Rowan opened his eyes, still glowing but softer now, like moonlight instead of fire. This is what I am, he said, his voice carrying to every person present. Not evil, not demonic, just different. I can make things grow. I can heal what's broken. I can bring beauty to dark places. Why is that wrong? No one answered. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, several people's faces showing shame as they realized what they'd almost done. The boy asks a fair question. A new voice spoke up. Margaret turned to see Dr. Sarah Chen, the village physician, stepping forward from the crowd. I've been listening to Pastor Wells's sermons about demons and evil, but all I see here is a frightened child and a remarkable gift. Where's the evil in that? The power itself is evil, Wells insisted, though his voice had lost its certainty. It defies natural law. Natural law includes children being born with extraordinary abilities, Dr. Chen interrupted. My daughter is what they call gifted. She can do mathematics in her head that takes computers to calculate. Is she demon-possessed, Pastor, or just different? That's not the same, isn't it? Another voice, this time old Jacob Morrison, who'd farmed these mountains for 70 years. My grandson can hear a song once and play it perfectly. Never had a lesson in his life. Is that evil too? Or is it just a gift none of us have? The crowd murmured, the certainty Wells had built beginning to crack. Margaret felt hope kindle in her chest. This boy has done nothing wrong, she said firmly. He came to me wounded and frightened. I took him in. He helped my garden grow and eased my arthritis pain. Those are the actions of a good soul, not an evil one. But the power, someone protested weakly. The power is just a tool, Dr. Chen said. Like any tool, it can be used for good or ill. What matters is the hand that wields it. And from what I've seen, this boy's hands have only healed and helped. Thank you, Rowan whispered, looking at Dr. Chen and Jacob with gratitude. Pastor Wells looked around, seeing his support crumbling. You're all fools, he spat. When that thing shows its true nature and destroys us all, remember I warned you. He turned and stalked away, a few die-hard supporters following. But most of the crowd remained, many now looking at the beautiful flowers with wonder rather than fear. I think, Jacob said slowly, maybe we owe this boy an apology, especially those of us who believed Wells without question. Several people nodded, shame-faced. A woman Margaret recognized as Amy Sullivan stepped forward. I'm sorry, she said to Rowan. I was afraid, but fear's no excuse for cruelty. Others echoed her apology. Not everyone. Some still watched Rowan with suspicion, but enough that Margaret felt the immediate danger had passed. Dr. Chen approached Margaret and Rowan. I'd like to examine him if you're willing. Those scars suggest serious medical trauma, and if Pastor Wells and his people did what I suspect, there should be documentation, evidence. We'd appreciate that, Margaret said, then looked at Rowan. If you're comfortable. The boy nodded, exhaustion clear on his face. The display of power had drained him, and he swayed where he stood. Margaret caught him before he fell. Let's get you inside, she said gently. You've had enough excitement for one night. As she helped Rowan back to the cottage, the crowd dispersed, many carrying flowers that had bloomed in the magical display. Margaret noticed several people touching the blossoms with reverence. as if recognizing something holy in what they'd just witnessed. Inside, Margaret settled Rowan on the couch, while Dr. Chen retrieved her medical bag from her car. The examination was thorough and gentle, but Margaret saw the doctor's expression darken as she cataloged the boy's injuries. These burns were deliberate, Dr. Chen said quietly, applied in patterns consistent with ritualistic abuse. In these silver markings, I've never seen scarring quite like this. It's as if the tissue has transformed at a cellular level. What does that mean? Margaret asked. I'm not sure, but combined with what we witnessed outside, I think Rowan's biology may be fundamentally different from normal human physiology. He's not sick or possessed. He's simply other. Other, Rowan repeated softly. That's what I've always felt. Other. Not quite human, but not knowing what else I might be. Dr. Chen sat beside him. Different doesn't mean wrong, Rowan. It means unique, special. And the gifts you have, the ability to heal and grow things, those are precious. This world needs more beauty and healing, not less. Most people don't see it that way, Rowan said. Most people fear what they don't understand. Dr. Chen agreed. But that's their limitation, not yours. With time and education, people can learn. What happened tonight, showing them beauty instead of violence, that was perfect. You proved you're not a threat. Not everyone was convinced, Margaret observed. No, Dr. Chen admitted. Pastor Wells and his inner circle will remain problematic, but they've lost credibility tonight. When the church council meets next, I'll be there to argue against any action toward Rowan. And I know others who'll speak up too. After Dr. Chen left, promising to return the next day, Margaret helped Rowan to his room. The boy was asleep almost before his head hit the pillow, his body finally able to rest after weeks of constant vigilance. Margaret returned to her living room and surveyed the changed landscape visible through her window. Flowers still bloomed everywhere, their blossoms glowing faintly in the darkness. The village would wake to a transformed world, and she had no idea what tomorrow would bring. But tonight, a frightened child slept safely in her home, and that, Margaret decided, was enough. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Not angry mobs, but curious townspeople who wanted to see the miraculous flowers up close. Children played among the blossoms while their parents asked tentative questions about the healing boy. Margaret answered what she could while keeping Rowan inside, letting him rest. The exhaustion from the previous night's display hadn't fully lifted, and she wanted him recovered before facing more public scrutiny. Dr. Chen returned as promised, this time accompanied by Sheriff Tom Bradley. Margaret tensed until Chen explained. Tom's here to take a statement about what Pastor Wells and his people did to Rowan, official documentation of the abuse. The sheriff, a practical man in his 50s, listened gravely as Rowan described his treatment in the church basement. When he finished, Bradley closed his notebook with a sigh. I've suspected Wells crossed lines before, he said, but without evidence or victims willing to come forward, my hands were tied. With your testimony, Rowan, and Dr. Chen's medical documentation, I can file charges: assault, kidnapping, child endangerment, possibly more. Will it make a difference? Margaret asked. Wells has influence in this town. Less than he did yesterday, Bradley replied. Half the congregation walked out during this morning's service when he tried to preach about demonic possession. People witnessed what the boy did, choosing beauty over violence. That's got folks questioning Wells's narrative. Over the following days, the village transformed. Not just physically, though Rowan's flowers continued to bloom with supernatural persistence, but culturally. Those who had feared the demon child began to reconsider after their ailing grandmother's arthritis improved when Rowan visited, or their dying garden suddenly flourished. Rowan himself began to venture out, always accompanied by Margaret. They walked through town, and gradually people stopped staring. Children, less burdened by adult prejudices, approached him with questions about the flowers. Could he make them grow in specific colors? Could he teach them? I don't know how to teach it, Rowan admitted to a group of curious kids. It's just something I am, not something I do. Like you don't have to think about making your heart beat. That's so cool, breathed a girl about Rowan's age. I wish I could do magic. It's not really magic, Rowan said. More like understanding plants so well I can encourage them to grow. They want to grow anyway. I just help them along. Margaret watched these interactions with quiet joy. This was what Rowan needed. Acceptance, community, the chance to be a child instead of a symbol of fear. But Pastor Wells hadn't given up. When criminal charges were filed against him, he filed countercharges claiming Rowan had used supernatural powers to assault him. The case became tangled in legal complexity. How did the law address abilities that defied scientific explanation? The resolution came from an unexpected source. A representative from Greenwood Institute arrived in Pinehaven, a prestigious research facility that studied unusual human abilities. Dr. Michael Torres, the representative, requested a meeting with Margaret and Rowan. We've been following reports about a child with remarkable healing and botanical abilities, Torres explained in Margaret's living room. Greenwood Institute isn't interested in exploiting Rowan or treating him like a specimen. We're a school and research center for individuals with extraordinary gifts, children like him. There are others, Rowan asked, hope lighting his face. Dozens, Torres confirmed, children who can manipulate elements, who see beyond normal perception, who heal with touch or communicate with animals, gifts that society doesn't understand and often fears. At Greenwood, they find community, education, and most importantly, they learn control. Margaret felt her protective instincts flare. You want to take him away, not take, Torres corrected gently. Offer an option. Greenwood is a boarding school, yes, but students return home during holidays. Families are encouraged to visit. And for guardians like yourself, Margaret, we provide housing on campus if you'd like to be nearby. What would I learn there? Rowan asked quietly. How to understand your abilities, how to use them without exhausting yourself, how to shield yourself from those who might try to exploit or harm you for being different. Torres pulled out a tablet, showing images of a beautiful campus with diverse students. Most importantly, you'd learn you're not alone, not a freak or a demon, just a young person with extraordinary gifts that need guidance to flourish safely. Margaret looked at Rowan, seeing the longing in his eyes. He wanted this, wanted to understand himself, wanted to meet others like him. But she also saw his hesitation, his fear of leaving the first safe place he'd found. Can we visit? Margaret asked, before making any decisions. Of course, Torres said. I can arrange a tour whenever you're ready. They visited Greenwood Institute 3 weeks later. The campus sprawled across 100 wooded acres, buildings that blended modern architecture with natural elements. But what struck Rowan most were the students. A girl who made fire dance between her fingers while laughing with friends. A boy who floated textbooks around his dorm room using only his mind. Twins who seemed to communicate without speaking, moving in perfect synchronization. And in the botanical gardens, a teenager who, like Rowan, could make plants respond to his presence. That's Marcus, Torres introduced them. He's been with us for 3 years. Marcus, this is Rowan. He has abilities similar to yours. Marcus grinned, extending a hand covered in green vines that grew from his skin like tattoos. Finally, I've been the only green thumb here. Want to see something cool? He led them to a section of garden that was bare soil. Marcus knelt, pressing both palms to the earth, and a massive sunflower erupted from the ground in seconds, growing to full height in a dizzying display. Rowan's eyes widened. I've never seen anyone else do that, right? Marcus laughed. It's amazing not being the weird one for once. Here, try with me. Let's make a whole field. Together, the two boys created a meadow of wildflowers in minutes, their powers feeding off each other's energy. Margaret watched Rowan's face transform from guarded to joyful, and she knew what his decision would be. That evening, as they drove back to Pinehaven, Rowan spoke softly. I want to go, Mrs. Hayes, but I don't want to leave you either. Then we'll both go, Margaret said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. Dr. Torres said they have housing for guardians. I'm retired. Nothing ties me to Pinehaven. Why not start a new adventure? You'd do that. Leave your home for me. Margaret reached over and squeezed his hand. Rowan, you are my home now. Wherever you are, that's where I belong. The move happened quickly. Margaret sold her cottage to Dr. Chen, who wanted to turn it into a community clinic. The miraculous flowers had become a tourist attraction, bringing visitors to Pinehaven, and Chen believed the cottage's healing atmosphere maintained by the residual energy Rowan had infused into the land would make it the perfect medical space. Pastor Wells had been quietly removed from his position after an internal church investigation substantiated the abuse charges. He left Pinehaven in disgrace, his congregation rebuilt under new leadership that preached acceptance rather than fear. On their last day in town, dozens of people came to say goodbye. Many brought gifts, homemade preserves, knitted scarves, drawings from children who'd befriended Rowan. Amy Sullivan, who'd been one of the first to apologize, gave Rowan a journal. For recording your journey, she said, so you never forget where you came from and how many people learned to see past their fear because of you. At Greenwood Institute, Margaret moved into a small apartment in the Guardian Housing Complex, a community of parents and caregivers who'd relocated to stay close to their extraordinary children. She found immediate friendship with other adults who understood the unique challenges of raising children with powers. Rowan thrived. Under expert instruction, he learned to control his abilities, to summon them at will rather than having them triggered by emotion. He learned his limitations too, the exhaustion that came from overuse, the importance of grounding himself in earth to recharge. But more than skills, he gained confidence. At Greenwood, being different was normal. Having powers was expected. For the first time in his remembered life, Rowan wasn't other. He was just Rowan. Margaret started teaching again, offering literature classes to Greenwood students. Her decades of experience with all types of children translated perfectly to working with powered youth. She became known as the teacher who saw students first, abilities second. Months turned into years.
Rowan grew taller, his silver scars fading slightly, though never disappearing entirely. He never recovered his memories from before the mountains. Whatever had happened there remained locked away, but he decided it didn't matter. His life began the day Margaret opened her door to a wounded stranger and chose kindness over fear. On the 5th anniversary of that night, they returned to Pinehaven for a visit. The cottage-turned-clinic was thriving, and the flowers Rowan had created still bloomed year-round, a permanent gift to the community. They visited the garden where Rowan had first healed the plants, where Margaret had first witnessed his gift. It looked different now, carefully maintained by Dr. Chen and volunteers who turned it into a public space called Rowan's Garden. A plaque at the entrance read, "In memory of the fear we overcame and the beauty we almost destroyed. May we always choose understanding over ignorance and love over fear." "They named it after you," Margaret said softly. "No," Rowan replied, studying the inscription. "They named it after what we all learned together. That different isn't dangerous. That power can heal. That miracles happen when we're brave enough to open our doors to strangers." That evening, they stood on the hill overlooking Pinehaven as the sun set. The village below glowed with warm light, its people going about their evening routines in a town transformed by one boy's gift and one woman's courage. "Do you ever wonder where you really came from?" Margaret asked. "What made you the way you are?" Rowan shrugged. "Sometimes, but I think maybe I came from exactly where I needed to. The mountains gave me power, pain taught me compassion, and you taught me that family isn't about blood, it's about who shows up when you need them most." Margaret pulled him close. "You're wise beyond your years. I had a good teacher." As darkness fell, they walked back to Dr. Chen's clinic where they were staying overnight. Inside, Chen had prepared dinner and gathered a small group: the sheriff, Jacob Morrison, Amy Sullivan, and several others who'd become friends. "To Rowan," Chen toasted, raising her glass, "who taught us that the greatest miracles are often wrapped in the most unexpected packages." To Margaret, Rowan countered, "Who taught me that home isn't a place, it's a person who sees you as you are and loves you anyway." They drank and talked and laughed late into the night. Outside, Rowan's flowers bloomed in the darkness, their petals glowing with faint silver light, a reminder that magic existed in the world, if only people were brave enough to embrace it. Years later, when Rowan graduated from Greenwood Institute with honors, he returned to Pinehaven not as a frightened child, but as a confident young man. He opened a healing center in the cottage, using his gifts to help those suffering from chronic pain and terminal illnesses. Margaret, now in her 80s but still sharp and active, worked alongside him. Together, they created a place where people from all over came seeking hope, and found it in the hands of a boy who'd once been called Demon, but proved himself an angel. The mountain that had birthed Rowan's power watched over them all, content that its gift had found worthy guardians. And in the soil beneath Pinehaven, the seeds of acceptance planted that November night continued to grow, spreading roots deep into the community, ensuring that no child would ever again be persecuted for being extraordinary.
On Margaret's 90th birthday, surrounded by friends and former students, she sat in Rowan's garden and reflected on the path her life had taken. She'd been a teacher for 40 years, but her greatest lesson had come after retirement: that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to do what's right despite it. Rowan, now 25 and powerful in ways that went far beyond his botanical gifts, sat beside her, gray beginning to touch his temples, though his eyes still held that silver glow. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." "Thank you," Margaret replied, "for teaching an old woman that it's never too late for adventure. That family finds us in the strangest ways, and that sometimes the greatest gift we can give is simply opening a door and saying, 'You're safe here.'" As the sun set on another day in Pinehaven, the flowers Rowan had created decades ago still bloomed, eternal and beautiful, a living testament to the power of acceptance and the magic that happens when fear is transformed into love.